Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to open the 15th annual Santa Clara County Children's Summit. We have a busy morning ahead of us, and I hope you have your oatmeal, your fruit bar, and a cup of tea. I also want to encourage you to use the chat today to say yes to something you hear one of the speakers say. To lift up your thoughts, let's communicate with one another throughout the day. We're going to start right off with our special guest, Kanyon Sayers-Roods, who will bring you into the circle of the Children's Summit.
Mishmin Tuhis, Countercot Canyon, Coyote Woman, Sayers-Roods. I am here. Oh, was that? I am here in Tamian Ohlone territory, and I encourage you to check out native-land.ca to learn about the native lands that you are on. I come from Indian Canyon Nation, the only federally recognized Indian country between Sonoma and Santa Barbara along central coastal California. That being said, I am daughter of Tribal Chairwoman Anne Marie Sayers, and I recognize my privilege being raised on the land of my ancestors. And part of our community, part of culture sharing, part of coming from a matrilineal society, we always remember that my mother taught me and my grandmother taught her that when song, ceremony, and dancing stops, so does the earth. I too believe that. So I want to ground us and offer a grandmother song to honor our grandmothers, their grandmothers, and in all Mother Earth. For without them and without her, we would not be here. We share this time and space together for a reason. So it's with that humility, that gratitude, that present-mindedness that I offer this song here in this space today. And whenever I visit schools or circles, at the end of our prayers, we say, "Oh." So you are more than welcome to say "Oh" at the end of this song. It's just a way to let those songs, those prayers, those energies, those intentions to go out in a good way. I'm going to use my regalia as an instrument. This is my medicine. Native peoples, we don't wear costumes, and my regalia is my medicine, and I'm going to use it to help with this song. Moi moi o kawan, moi moi o kawan, moi moi no ho, moi moi o kawan, moi moi o ne o konale, moi moi o konale. Moi moi o kawan, moi moi o kawan, moi moi no, moi moi o kawan, moi moi o ne o konale, moi moi o konale. Moi moi o kawan, moi moi o kawan, moi moi no, moi moi o kawan, moi moi o ne ai o kule, moi moi ai o kulali. Oh, oh, oh. Sorry about that. I can breathe. I swear I can. Give me 2 seconds. Much better. Much better. I got COVID over New Year's, so my breathing and my throat have not been the same. Apologies. Oh, so if you ever get a chance to go to any Native gathering or rally or a space, by saying "oh" is in it's a good way to be in solidarity. Like sometimes at like an archaeological conference, there's a handful of natives, but sometimes we're usually sitting on the edges of the room. And at these archaeological conferences, they do have land acknowledgments at the beginning, especially if there's an indigenous person at the front and they acknowledge the land. And when they end the prayer, you'll hear a couple of natives go "oh," and a couple of the community members are like, "oh, there's natives here." But then that elder might continue saying a few more things, layers to the prayer, or even at like rallies or gatherings, like "welcome to Ohlone territory." "Oh, we are still here." "Oh," things like that. It's a good way to just be in solidarity. It's so much better than clapping. Plus, in our community, clapping is loud and it's jarring. All right, so as I mentioned, I'm in Tamian Ohlone territory, aka Santa Clara County territories. I come from the Mutsun Ohlone speaking territory, which is down in the South Bay. And I am CEO of Kanyon Consulting, which is a consultation firm dedicated to bridging the gap between Indigenous and contemporary value systems. So, that being said, I love teaching teachers. I love influencing community members because, well, mainstream society and Western settler colonial academia has done us a disservice. It hasn't honored truth in history. So many times, from as simple as, do we see ourselves represented in the history books and the way the narratives are shared? I myself, as a brown, queer, indigenous, female bodied being, do not see any representation in many of the history books. Yeah, I may have witnessed or heard of Sacagawea, maybe I got to hear about Tubman a little bit. I got to hear about Rosa Parks, but I've actually learned more about these community members from TikTok these past couple of years. That's really sad. I identify as neurodivergent, and the funny part is I've never had a fidget spinner, so thank you. I do know I've always needed fidget-like toys to pay attention, and so identifying as neurodivergent and having struggled in my academic career has been a challenge. So I want to voice that there are different ways that we approach education and approach culture sharing and just acknowledging truth and history and the beautiful layers. I venture to say that a large handful of you, a large portion of my audience may have heard history be about indigenous peoples be represented as Native American hunter gatherer. You do realize that that thoroughly dismisses indigenous peoples as the first land stewards, as the first managers of the land, as the first doctors, not shaman, the first hydrologists, the first astrologists, the first everything. Because if we look at 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens sapien came into existence. Indigenous peoples from around the world who are nomadic, who do travel, who did not come across the Bering Strait. That is a theory, and yes, people did travel across it and back and forth because there is archaeological data that proves that there have been humans existing in the Americas before then. So please, when you glom on to Western settler science, please note that it also is a dogma. It is a doctrine. It is a belief system. It's constantly evolving. That indigenous peoples historically have been stewarding these lands since time immemorial with a relationship and pedagogies and societal governing structures of which our current academic environment has not thoroughly validated. So when we talk about indigenous peoples, I understand how the English language tells you that if you have not met or interfaced with people and we're referring to people in a historical sense, we use the past terms, i.e., they were, they did, they used to. Do you know that when you teach your young students words like this, you are actively engaging in cultural erasure? So when we speak about indigenous peoples, I hope that you can find ways to incorporate present tense or incorporate culturally competent approaches about traditionally indigenous peoples lived and utilized the resources of the land. Today, they are in community with us. Because when I was 5, a little boy said, "If you're Indian, you're dead." He legitimately erased my existence because he didn't know anything. I could be sad and mad at him for behaving that way. I could be sad and mad about his parents allowing him to engage in conversation like that. Am I mad at his parents for not knowing? Am I mad at the teacher for not teaching? Do they know? So the struggle with that is, how are we engaging in culturally competent and inclusive methodologies of acknowledging that there's layers of history that we don't know, and they are challenging to talk about. But you know what? As an Indigenous brown queer individual who definitely was out and loud about my identity, as well as I had no choice of how I presented myself, I was experiencing colorism, classism, microaggressions at age 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And when people say, "Oh, let's not talk about genocide to kids," I visit third and fourth graders. I visit kindergartners and I talk about genocide. I talk about slavery. Well, I don't actually legitimately talk about rape, but I talk about how violation of human rights to these young ones in an empathetic storytelling fashion, and they're not traumatized. I want to point that out, that when we try and engage in civility politics and try and silence, "Oh, I don't think they're ready," we're actually hurting the way we're sharing these narratives. And so many times there are college students that come to my mother and myself and our community, and they say, they almost have like I'll call it an academic heart attack. They're like, in elementary school, I feel as though my teachers lied to me. In high school and natural history and California history and social studies, they told us a few things, a few layers about history, about Native peoples, but I still feel like they lied to me. It took them until their academic career to even take Native studies to get a comprehensive understanding about Indigenous peoples and history. Like, I would like any of you to out yourself right now. If you are 10 years older than me, 10 years, I was born in 1988. So if you were born before 1978, like, for those of you who are lower, put a 0. For those of you who have been, put a 1. If you were born before 1978, ping into the chat, because I want to point out there are times that I get parents and adults to raise their hand. I'm like, "How many of you were born in 1978?" And some people raise their hand, right? They're raising their hand, and I'm like, "Did you know that you were born before the Native American had the right to practice religion freely?" I was taught in school that America was founded on freedom of persecution and of religion. For who? Not Indigenous peoples. And so you were born. There are community members around us that were born before the Native American had the right to practice religion freely. We don't have the right to practice religion in prisons. We don't have the right to practice religion in schools. And our spirituality is constantly dismissed. People take photographs of us disrespectfully because just because we're not in a church, behind walls, behind fences, in a private space, doesn't mean, because we're in a public space, in a gathering space, doesn't mean what we're doing isn't important. So all of these rules and these perspectives that we've been raised by, Western settler colonialism, is entitled, is affluent, is negligent of accountability, of its sacred obligation and responsibility. It is engaged in a materialistic, disposable society model, and it has forgotten how to honor life, honor the sacred. How are we impacting our community? How are we impacting not only ourselves, but our community, not just human to humans, but our green relatives, our animal relatives? They came first. Technically, Indigenous peoples around the world have always said the plants and the animals, they came first. They're the first people. Humans have been given life to tend and steward and to be good ancestors in training. So how are we being accountable to recognizing how our actions and words impact our community, our environment, and the next 7 generations? How are we being good ancestors in training? So I ask you that when you impact these young ones' lives, are we being inclusive? Are we being culturally competent? Are we being culturally sensitive? We're not going to get it right, but we can do better, at least by comparison to my academic career and especially generations before me. There are some teachers that are doing amazing work, and some of y'all are inspiring me. So I'm not calling out anyone in this particular circle, but I'm saying how are we doing better? Because it's really, really important that we impact these young lives in a good way. And what better way than in community? Because as my mother taught me, when song, ceremony, and dancing stops, so does the earth. When you think about it, that Western settler colonial mindset has taught us if I'm not good at singing and I can't capitalize off of it, I'm not a singer. If I'm not good at dancing and I can't capitalize and make money off of it or get attention from it, I'm not a good dancer. If I don't believe in a certain faith, other faiths are going to suppress me and silence me. Ceremony. These are all things that all humans deserve and have the right to do and should be doing. And I, as a spiritual being who does not like to conform to many doctrines or religions, um, struggle with some of those belief systems due to what humans do in the name of it. I recognize that. However, to be a spiritual being and to align breathing together, align even just or just dancing together. You don't have to be capitalizing off of it to make money or do greatness. All of us can dance. All of us can sing. And that's what these young ones can be and should be doing. And we could do so in beautiful ways without engaging in cultural appropriation. We can engage in cultural appreciation and celebrate our diversity and align in unity. And so I want to thank you for being there for these young ones because a lot of our community members, I'm recognizing as a millennial, I know my time is coming close. I recognize as a millennial, as a digital native, that well, just with digital interfacing, I recognize that I learned in the weeds, I learned in the wild, and now my generation is having kids, and no one taught them how to interface with the internet and interface with these things, and therefore there is limited opportunity for these ones to teach how to interface with this technology. And the hard part is we're using these devices to babysit, and when we use these devices to babysit these young ones who are prepubescent, bullying and sensitivity and empathy are still being developed. And when they're impacted by these things, it's the proverbial TP on your foot walking out the door when you only have 10 people giggling at you. Now you have 10,000 people laughing at you. And so I invite people to consider what does it mean to remember when we learn things for the first time, to utilize empathetic storytelling. And when, if you can't empathize with other people's perspectives, find them. Bring Indigenous peoples to your classroom, hire Indigenous peoples or community members of that community versus the stereotypical, oh my gosh, it's Native American Heritage Month. We need to do all the Native stuff at this window of time. Let's talk about it through the whole year. Oh my gosh, it's February, it's African American History Month. And then all of a sudden we don't talk about it through the rest of the year. We are perpetuating Western settler colonial mentality that is negligent of accountability to truth and history. Let's talk about the layers of history. Let's talk about some of the uncomfortable things because we don't want to give these young ones a heart attack when they go forward in life because we are then perpetuating the fragility. The fragility is steering a lot of conversations. The fragility is where, like, white fragility, male fragility, I suffer from rejection sensitivity fragility. I literally do. So it's not just one thing or another. I'm not saying like one group of people have this, but the fragility of certain behaviors steer conversations, and we actually should be having those uncomfortable conversations. Yes, age appropriate, but let's as I said, as a brown, queer, female bodied, indigenous person, not seeing myself represented in history, I was suffering and navigating microaggressions when I was a child. So when people say, "Oh, let's not talk about that because it's really heavy and deep information," there's ways to talk about it. I just talked to 400 students, and I talked about genocide and the three waves of history when the the Spaniard occupation, where they killed Native peoples for being themselves, Mexican occupation of California, especially when California was Mexico for a short window of time, and still encouraging and demanding everyone speak Spanish. And then Gold Rush, $5 a head, 50 cents a scalp to eradicate the California native that the United States government put out $1.4 million to validate genocide. Oh, wait, that's a piece of history that nobody ever talks about. Things like that. I told that to kids. And I said it's not really good when someone else comes in and telling you what to do and saying what you're doing is wrong. Would you want somebody to do that? And they go, no. Simple and inclusive and helpful, because we don't want to repeat these things. So I get intense. I have educational materials on my website. I have these conversations all the time, and I'm excited. I just got a cool book. Come on, be my friend, be my friend. Come on, be. Aha. Okay. This book is called "We Are the Middle of Forever," and it's Indigenous Voices from Turtle Island on the Changing Earth by Stan Rushworth and Dahar Jamal. And I have a cool cultural competency chapter. I actually talk about cultural competency, and I am not a writer. I got to speak, and I had advocacy. I had community advocacy who were able to take my interview and write it for me, because I, as a neurodivergent, ADHD, dyslexic, Indigenous individual, can't just sit down and write. But many people say your perspective and your voice needs to be heard. So I'm really blessed to work with amazing allies, accomplices, co-conspirators, and advocates, and it's community members like that that are needed. So I will hunt down the link and I will add this into the chat in a little bit. But on my website, canyonconsulting.com, are educational materials such as book recommendations, and there's even a curriculum about Ohlone people. And if those of you who are in San Jose or Santa Clara, look up Tamian Nation. Tamian Nation are the local indigenous community members. There's also the Muwekma tribe. They're more Santa Clara, but they go towards East Bay in Fremont. If you ever are in San Francisco, go to ramatush.com. I'll be adding these links, but they're on my website. So hint, hint, educational resources galore. But I want to thank you, because you're on the front line and you're there with these young ones, inspiring them and sometimes reminding them how to be good little humans, good little ancestors in training. And so I encourage you to continue your journey in being a good ancestor in training. And I'm so very glad to be here. This picture back here is our spirit rock with abalone praying with the healing pole, an internationally renowned carver, and a flag to honor MMIW, missing and murdered Indigenous women. Healing pole is carved by Shane Tono Eagleton. There's one at the Shoreline Amphitheater. My website is Kanyon Consulting, both with K's, because in our language, Canyon is K, and my mom actually named me Canyon with a K, and then because it's per our language, consulting with a K versus ch, because C is our ch in the Mutsun dialect. So I'm so appreciative to be here. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Welcome to Ohlone territory, and let's have fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kanyon, for welcoming us this morning, reminding us who we are and where we are, for the beautiful reminders about the power of inclusion and the capacity and resilience of our children and our responsibility to them. So thank you so much for welcoming us this morning and getting us started on the right track.